My name is Vera Sterling. In the world of global logistics, they say your heart should be as tough as a shipping container and your mind as precise as a maritime schedule. My father, Silas Sterling, built an empire on blood, sweat, and a total lack of empathy. He always called me too soft because I preferred data analysis and infrastructure mapping to his brute force negotiations. On my brother Julian's wedding day, a lavish affair that cost more than a small cargo ship, my father decided to finalize his legacy. He stood before the elite of the shipping world and handed Julian 100% of the company's voting shares. To me, his only daughter, he handed a rusted key and a deed to a crumbling 19th century warehouse in the oldest part of the port. It was a public humiliation disguised as an inheritance. But my father forgot one thing. He taught me to read maps, but I taught myself to read the earth beneath them. That useless warehouse isn't just a pile of bricks. It's the literal heart of the regional rail network. Every track, every switch, and every container moving toward Julian's shiny new terminals must pass through my gate. Julian has the ships, and Father has the glory. But I have the junction. And starting today, the price of passage is going to cost them everything. Part 1. The wedding gift of rust. In logistics, distance is an illusion. The only thing that matters is the bottleneck. You can own 1,000 trucks, but if the bridge is closed, you own 1,000 tons of stationary metal. My father understood the ocean, but he never bothered to look at the tracks beneath his own feet. The ballroom of the Sterling estate was a sea of white orchids and black tuxedos. It was Julian's third wedding, this time to the daughter of a Port Authority director, and the air was thick with the scent of champagne and calculated alliances. I sat at the family table, relegated to the quiet corner, watching my brother soak in the adoration of 100 sycophants. "Attention, everyone!" My father's voice boomed, silencing the string quartet. He stood at the head of the table, his face a map of scars and sun-hardened skin. "Today isn't just about a union of families, it's about the future of Sterling Global." He pulled 2 envelopes from his jacket. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had spent 6 years optimizing our inland routes, saving the company millions in fuel costs. I hoped, that today he would finally see me as a partner. "Julian," Father said, his voice thick with pride, "you've shown the grit and the iron will that this company needs. You are my successor. Within this envelope are the controlling shares of Sterling Global. The fleet is yours. The terminals are yours. The world is yours." The room erupted in applause. Julian smirked at me, the golden child basking in his coronation. "And for Vera," my father continued, his tone shifting to something like pity. The room went silent. "My daughter who has a mind for the small details. I'm giving you the roots of our history, the original Sterling Depot at Berth 4. It's a quiet place, away from the chaos of the main terminals. You can turn it into an art gallery or a boutique, something more suited to your gentle nature." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The Sterling Depot was a joke. It was a derelict warehouse built in 1890, surrounded by overgrown tracks and salt-eaten fences. It hadn't seen a cargo box in 30 years. I stood up, my face a mask of calm. I took the rusted key. "Thank you, Father. I'll make sure it receives the attention it deserves." I didn't stay for the cake. I drove straight to the docks. The port at 2 a.m. is a symphony of industrial groans. I stood before berth 4, the fog rolling in from the Atlantic. The warehouse was a monster of brick and rotted timber, looming over the stagnant water. But I wasn't looking at the building. I was looking at the ground. I pulled out my tablet, pulling up the ultra-high-resolution property survey I had commissioned in secret months earlier. When the port was expanded in the 90s, the engineers had been lazy. To save money on land acquisition, they had routed the main spine line, the only rail connection linking the deep-water terminals to the national grid, right through a narrow strip of land. My strip of land. The Sterling Depot wasn't just a warehouse. The property line extended 60 feet out from the walls in every direction. According to the deed, I owned the land beneath the tracks for a 100-yard stretch. For 30 years, the company had been using this historical easement for free because Father owned both the company and the warehouse. But the company wasn't his anymore. It was Julian's. And the warehouse wasn't the company's. It was mine. "Soft, Father?" I whispered to the wind. "Let's see how hard Julian is when the spine stops breathing." The next morning, I didn't go to my office at Sterling HQ. I went to the depot. I hired a team of surveyors and a private security firm. By noon, we had erected a massive chain-link fence topped with razor wire cutting directly across the main railway tracks that fed Julian's primary terminal. At 1 p.m., a freight train, 60 cars long, carrying $20 million worth of electronics, came to a screeching halt 20 feet from my new fence. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Julian. "Vera, what the hell is going on? There's a fence on the spine. The conductor says there are guards with private property signs. Tell your idiots to move. I have 3 more trains scheduled before sundown." "Hello, Julian." I leaned back in a rusted folding chair inside my new office. "I think there's a misunderstanding. You're trespassing on the Sterling Depot property. I've checked the easement agreements. They expired in 1994 and were never renewed because Father never saw the point in paying himself rent." "Vera, don't be a child. Move the fence." "The rent for a private rail transit through my land is $5,000 per car. That train has 60 cars. That's $300,000 for a one-time passage. Or you can sign a 10-year lease for the land at $10 million a month." "You're insane. I'll have the Port Authority bulldoze that shack by sundown." "Try it. The deed is ironclad, and the Port Authority doesn't have jurisdiction over private historical landmarks. And Julian, the next train is due in 20 minutes. If it stops, the congestion will block up all the way to the state line. Your succession is looking a bit stagnant, don't you think?"
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
In the shipping business, strength is usually measured in horsepower and steel, but true power is silent. It's the power of a regulatory glitch, a legal loophole, and a microscopic organism that can bring a billion-dollar supply chain to its knees. My brother brought lawyers. I brought the law of the land. By 4 p.m., the Sterling spine was a graveyard of idle engines. The red lights of stationary locomotives stretched as far as the eye could see, a glowing artery of blocked commerce. Julian arrived at the depot in a black SUV, trailing a convoy of private security and men in yellow hard hats. He looked like he was ready for a war, but I was ready for an audit. "Vera, stop this madness right now!" Julian screamed, stepping out of the car. He pointed at the team of workmen behind him. "I have an emergency court order to clear obstructive debris from the transit lines. Move your guards or they're going to jail for interfering with maritime commerce." I didn't move from my chair. I simply sipped my coffee and held up a thick green-bound folder. "The court order is for debris, Julian, but this isn't debris. This is a federally protected habitat," I said, my voice projecting through the salt-heavy air. "What the hell are you talking about? 6 months ago, while you were busy picking out the silk for your wedding invitations, I invited the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to conduct a survey of Berth 4. It turns out that the rust moss growing on these 19th century tracks is actually Bryum sterlingia, a rare indigenous moss that only thrives in high-salinity, iron-rich environments. As of last Tuesday, this depot is a designated critical biodiversity node." Julian's face went from red to a terrifying shade of purple. "It's moss, Vera! It's dirt on old tracks!" Under the Federal Heritage and Environment Act, any construction, demolition, or heavy transit vibration within 50 feet of a protected node requires a multi-agency impact study. That study takes approximately 18 months. If you move 1 inch of that fence, or if one of your trains vibrates this ground without my environmental vibration mitigation protocol in place, the fine is $5 million per occurrence, and the CEO, that's you, Julian, faces personal criminal liability. The workmen with the crowbars stepped back. They weren't paid enough to go to federal prison for a moss-covered rail line. "You're bluffing," Julian hissed. "Check the Federal Registry, Julian. It's public record now. I've effectively turned my useless gift into a legal landmine. You can't go through me, and you certainly can't go around me. The sea is on one side, and the city's historic district is on the other." Just as the sun began to set, a second car arrived. This one didn't have security. It was the silver sedan belonging to our father. Silas Sterling stepped out, his presence casting a shadow longer than the warehouse itself. He looked at the line of stalled trains, then at the fence, and finally at me. "Vera, this has gone far enough. We are a family. We don't hold our own blood for ransom. This stunt is hurting the Sterling name. The port authorities are calling me, demanding to know why my daughter is sabotaging the city's economy." "I'm not sabotaging anything, Father. I'm simply managing my assets. You told me I was too soft for the big business of the fleet. You told me I should focus on small details. Well, this moss is a very small detail. This warehouse is a very small detail. But it seems the entire Sterling Empire is resting on them. What do you want? Money? You want a seat on the board? I'll give you 5% and a vice presidency. Just open the gates." 5%? I laughed, the sound sharp against the industrial silence. 10 years ago, I brought you the plan for the inland port expansion. You laughed and gave the project to Julian. He lost $60 million on it. 5 years ago, I identified the fuel cost leakage in our Mediterranean routes. You told me to stick to the paperwork. I've saved this company more money than Julian has ever made it, and you rewarded me with a pile of rust. I walked to the fence, looking my father in the eye. "I don't want a seat on your board. I want the lease. $300,000 per train paid upfront every single day. And I want a 51% stake in the Sterling Logistics subsidiary, the one that controls the land-based freight. Julian keeps the ships, since he loves the glory of the ocean, but I will control every inch of the land they touch." That's half the company's profit, Julian roared. We'll be bankrupt in a week. Then I suggest you start finding a way to make ships fly, Julian, because as of tomorrow morning, if the first payment isn't in my account, I'm starting a deep cleaning restoration of the tracks. It'll involve closing the spine for the next 3 months. Silas looked at the trains, then back at me. For the first time in my life, I didn't see pity in his eyes. I saw fear, and beneath that, a dark, begrudging respect. "You've been planning this a long time," he asked. "I've been planning this since the day I realized that being soft meant I was the only one in this family who actually bothered to look at the foundations. The clock is ticking, Father. Every hour those trains sit there, the retail giants are filing breach of contract lawsuits against Sterling Global. By my calculation, you're losing $200,000 every 60 minutes. Silas turned to Julian. "Give her what she wants." "Father, you can't—" "Give it to her," Silas barked. "She's outplayed us. She didn't just take the land. She took the air we breathe and the law we hide behind. Sign the interim agreement, now." I handed a digital tablet through the fence. The contract was already drafted. My legal team had been working on it for months. Julian's hand shook as he signed. With a single tap, the ownership of the regional logistics network shifted. I was no longer the daughter with the gentle nature. I was the owner of the bottleneck. But as the gates opened and the first train began to groan forward, I noticed something in the shadows of the warehouse. A man I didn't recognize was taking photos. Not a reporter, not a port official. He had the look of an investigator.
Ownership is a fragile concept when it stands in the path of a monopoly. I thought the federal moss was my ultimate shield, but I forgot that the Railroad Guild has been writing the rules of transit since the days of steam and coal. They don't just use the tracks, they think they are the tracks. But every old system has a blind spot, and mine was hidden right behind the crumbling brick of Berth 4. The victory over Julian felt like a fresh breeze until the black sedans arrived. They didn't have company logos, they had the discreet gold emblem of the Railroad Guild of the Atlantic, RGA. While my father's company, Sterling Global, owned the ships, the RGA was the invisible hand that moved every locomotive in the 3 neighboring states. 3 men stepped out. At the center was Arthur Vane, a man whose family had controlled the rail lines since 1880. He looked at my fence with a bored expression, as if he were looking at a fly on a windshield. "Miss Sterling," Vane said, his voice sounding like gravel grinding against steel. "A clever play with the environmentalists, truly, but you've triggered a national transit emergency. Under the Rail Safety Act of 1952, any private property that obstructs a primary artery can be seized for emergency nationalization if the flow of goods is deemed critical to the state's stability." "I've read the act, Mr. Vane," I replied, standing my ground. "It only applies if there is no alternative route. You could reroute through the North Junction." "The North Junction is undergoing maintenance," Vane smiled thinly, "for the next 6 months, which means your warehouse is currently the only way. You have 1 hour to dismantle this fence and sign over the transit rights to the RGA for a nominal fee of $1. If not, the federal marshals will be here by sunset to seize the property under the emergency clause." 1 hour? You're not even giving me time to call my lawyers? In a national emergency, lawyers are a luxury you don't have. 1 hour, Miss Sterling, or you lose the depot entirely. They left me standing in the dust. My father was watching from his car, a grim look on his face. He knew Vane. He knew the RGA. He probably had been paying them under the table for years to keep the Sterling ships moving. I retreated into the warehouse. The air inside was cool and smelled of damp earth and ancient timber.
I needed a countermove, something bigger than moss and fences. I began to pace the length of the building, my heels echoing on the concrete. As I passed the heavy support beams in the central hall, I noticed something. The vibrations from a distant shunting engine caused a specific section of the wall, cluttered with old sterling shipping manifests, to hum in a way it shouldn't. I pulled away the rotted papers. Behind them wasn't solid brick, but a heavy, riveted steel plate. It was a safe, but not a small one. It was integrated into the very foundation of the building. I used the rusted key my father had given me at the wedding. It didn't fit the main door, but it slid perfectly into a hidden keyhole at the base of the steel plate. With a groan of protesting metal, the plate swung open. It wasn't filled with gold or cash. It was filled with ledgers, blue-bound books dating back 40 years. I opened one. My eyes widened. These weren't just shipping records, they were off-book transit logs for the Railroad Guild. My father hadn't just owned a warehouse, he had been the black box for the RGA. For decades, the Guild had been using Berth 4 to move unregistered cargo, chemical waste, untaxed luxury goods, and hardware that didn't appear on any federal manifest. The depot wasn't a gift, it was a blackmail vault. So that's why you gave it to me. You didn't think I was too soft. You thought I would be the only one smart enough to find the leverage when the Guild finally came for us. I pulled out my phone and called the only person I knew would hate Arthur Vane as much as I did, Elena Thorne, the head of the Port Workers Union. We had been rivals for years, but the RGA was trying to automate the docks, which would put her people out of work. Elena, it's Vera Sterling. I have something the RGA would burn the city down to hide. I need a general strike at the North Junction, right now. A strike? Vera, you're the one who usually tries to break my strikes. Why should I help the Ice Queen of Sterling Global? Because if the RGA nationalizes my warehouse, they'll have total control over the port's logic. They'll replace your cranes with AI in a month. Help me hold them off for 24 hours and I'll give you the evidence to dismantle Vane's board of directors forever. There was a long silence. 24 hours, no more. I'll tell the boys the North Junction switches are malfunctioning due to a safety concern. By 6 p.m., the federal marshals arrived at my gate. Arthur Vane was with them, looking triumphant. "Time's up, Miss Sterling. Open the gate or we use the cutters." "Before you do that, Mr. Vane," I stepped out with a single blue ledger in my hand, "you might want to check your private servers. I've just uploaded a scan of the 1998 Mercury incident logs. You remember that, don't you? The illegal chemical spill that was cleaned up by a shell company owned by your brother." Vane froze. The color drained from his face, leaving it the color of old parchment. What do you mean?" "I have the original manifests, Arthur, signed by your father and mine. This warehouse is the vault of the Guild. If you move one step onto this property without my permission, those logs go to the Department of Justice and the Environmental Protection Agency. Your national emergency will turn into a national scandal before the sun goes down." I turned to the federal marshals. "Gentlemen, I believe there's been a mistake. Mr. Vane was just leaving to discuss a private lease agreement. Isn't that right, Arthur?" Vane looked at the marshals, then at me. He knew he was trapped. The nationalization was a legal weapon, but I was holding a nuclear one. "Withdraw the seizure," Vane managed to choke out. There's been a misunderstanding regarding the North Junction's status." As the sedans and the marshals retreated, my father walked up to the fence. He didn't look angry, he looked relieved. "I didn't think you'd find it so fast," he said softly. "You knew the RGA would come for the depot. You used me as bait to protect your own hide." "No, Vera,
I used you as the only person who could actually win. Julian would have sold those ledgers for a quick buck and got himself killed. You used them to take the throne. The RGA doesn't own the tracks anymore. You do, because you have their past in your basement. But my victory was interrupted by a loud rhythmic thudding from the harbor. Not a train, not a truck. 3 massive, unmarked cargo ships were entering the bay, bypassing the standard maritime checkpoints. They weren't flying the Sterling flag, they were flying the flag of Global Link, a tech logistics titan from the east that specialized in automated ghost ships. Who are they? I asked, a new coldness settling in my chest. The future, my father replied, his voice trembling. They don't use trains, Vera. They use heavy-lift drones and automated barges. They don't care about your warehouse. They're here to bypass the port entirely.
Innovation is just a fancy word for finding a new way to ignore the old rules. The ghost ships of Global Link were beautiful, terrifying machines, autonomous leviathans that didn't need a single dock worker or a single inch of my rail. They hovered in the bay like chrome vultures, launching swarms of heavy-lift drones that carried containers over the city's skyline like giant metallic insects. My bottleneck was suddenly irrelevant, or so they thought. The humming was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't the rhythmic clatter of trains, but a high-pitched electric whine that set my teeth on edge. From the roof of the Sterling Depot, I watched as the first swarm of Global Link drones, each the size of a small truck, lifted off from the deck of an unmarked ship. They bypassed my fences, my moss, and my ledgers, heading straight for a newly built sky hub 5 miles inland. Julian was there, of course. I could see him through my binoculars, standing on the deck of one of the Global Link ships, shaking hands with a woman in a silver tech suit. He had sold out. He was giving them the Sterling Fleet's docking codes in exchange for a seat at their automated table. "They're making us obsolete, Vera," my father said, standing beside me. He looked older than he had an hour ago. "The RGA is panicking, the union is screaming, but you can't fight a swarm with a fence." "You can't fight a swarm with a fence, Father," I said, my eyes tracking the drones to a specific point on the horizon. "But you can fight a swarm with an outlet." I went back down into the warehouse and pulled up the electrical grid maps of the port. The city had modernized 10 years ago, but the port's high-voltage infrastructure was still a mess of patchwork repairs. Because the Sterling Depot was a historical landmark, it sat directly on top of the substation 7G, the only high-density power node capable of feeding the massive electromagnetic charging pads that Global Link's drones required for their short-range, heavy-lift cycles. "Marcus," I called out to my head of security, "I need the blueprints for the basement's western wall, the part that connects to the municipal grid." "Vera, what are you planning?" "Global Link is using a pulse charge system," I explained, showing him my tablet. "They need huge bursts of energy every 10 minutes to keep those drones in the air. Substation 7G is the only thing that can provide that without blowing the city's residential breakers. And according to the property deed Father gave me, the substation isn't just under my warehouse, it's part of it." I didn't wait for permission. I had my team install a grid governor, a sophisticated piece of industrial hardware that allowed me to throttle the output of Substation 7G. At 8 p.m., Global Link began their first major midnight delivery cycle. 1,000 drones took to the air, carrying the season's most expensive consumer electronics. The hum grew to a roar. I stood by the governor. 3, 2, 1. Throttle. I slammed the lever down. The power output to the Sky Hub dropped by 80%. Across the bay, the glowing charging pads on the Global Link ships flickered and died. The drones, halfway to their destination and suddenly deprived of their mid-flight energy boost, began to wobble. Their automated safety protocols kicked in. Low power, emergency descent. 1,000 drones worth billions in cargo slowly drifted down like falling leaves, landing in the mud of the tidal flats, on the roofs of random parking garages, and in the middle of the port's shipping lanes. My phone rang within seconds. It wasn't Julian, it was the woman in the silver suit, Sora Chen, the CEO of GlobalLink. "Miss Sterling?" Her voice was calm, but I could hear the sharp edge of a shark underneath. "I've just caused $3 billion in logistics delays. My drones are safely grounded, but my clients are already filing liquidated damages. I assume you have an explanation for the power surge originating from your property?" "It wasn't a surge, Ms. Chen. It was a conservation effort," I replied, leaning back in my chair. "My warehouse is a historical site. The high-voltage draw from your charging pads was causing structural vibrations that threatened the integrity of my 19th-century brickwork. I've had to limit the output to protect the heritage of the port." "You're extorting me, Vera. You don't even use that power." "I don't, but I own the pipe it flows through. You want your drones back in the air? You'll need a stability easement from the Sterling Depot. The price is simple. GlobalLink must use the Sterling rail network for all last-mile heavy deliveries. No drones over the city. You drop the containers at my warehouse, and my trains take them inland." "My business model is no tracks, Vera. I'm not going back to the steam age." "Then I suggest you buy a lot of batteries, because Substation 7G is closed for structural inspection indefinitely." I hung up, but I knew this was a temporary fix. Sora Chen didn't get to be a billionaire by playing by the rules. An hour later, Julian burst into the warehouse. He looked disheveled, his wedding ring missing from his finger. "Vera, you have to stop. Sora's going to the governor. She's going to have the state declare eminent domain over the substation. You can't fight the future." "I am the future, Julian," I said, walking towards him. "You sold father's ships for a seat at a table where you're just a servant. I'm building my own table, and I need to know, what did Sora promise you in exchange for our father's private encryption keys?" Julian flinched. I don't know what you're talking about." "She's hacking the RGA ledgers, isn't she? She wants the black box data I found in the wall. She doesn't want the warehouse for the power. She wants it to erase the evidence of the guild's crimes so she can replace them without any legal baggage." Suddenly, the warehouse lights flickered, not because of my governor, but from an external source. A red alarm light began to pulse on my terminal. "Vera!" Marcus shouted. "We have a breach. It's not drones, it's a cyber siphon. Someone is bypassing our firewalls through the substation's diagnostic port." I looked at Julian. He was holding a small, glowing device in his hand. He had been the Trojan horse. "I'm sorry, Vera, but she promised to make me the head of the new GlobalLink Atlantic. I couldn't stay in your shadow forever." The data began to pour out of my servers. The RGA ledgers, the shipping manifests, and the black box. Everything I had used to neutralize the guild was being uploaded to GlobalLink's cloud. Once they had it, they could destroy my leverage and have me arrested for corporate espionage using the very data I was protecting. I had 30 seconds to act. I didn't try to stop the upload. I did the only thing a soft daughter would do. I used the meltdown protocol. I didn't just throttle the power. I reversed the flow. "Marcus, disconnect the local servers. We're going to hotwire the siphon." I grabbed the diagnostic cable Julian had plugged in and jammed it directly into the high-voltage relay of the governor. "Warning, voltage overflow, hardware termination imminent." A massive arc of blue electricity leapt from the terminal, shattering the glass in the warehouse windows. The hacking device in Julian's hand exploded in a shower of sparks, throwing him across the room. Across the bay, the server banks on Sora Chen's lead ship erupted in flames as the 50,000-volt surge traveled back through the data link. The upload stopped, the data was scrambled, and Sora Chen's ghost ships were suddenly blind. I stood in the smoking ruins of my office, my hair wild, my face covered in soot. Julian was groaning on the floor, his hands burned. The black box was safe, but my warehouse was a mess. But then,
Out of the smoke, my father appeared. He wasn't looking at the damage. He was looking at a hidden compartment in the floor that the electrical surge had accidentally blown open. "Vera," he whispered, pointing into the hole. Deep beneath the warehouse, below the substation and the tracks, was a second vault, one that didn't have a lock. It was a refrigerated chamber, and inside weren't ledgers or diamonds. They were seeds. Thousands of glass vials containing the DNA and seeds of every major crop on the continent. The Sterling Depot wasn't a logistics hub. It was the lifeline. Your grandfather built this during the Cold War. He knew that one day the world would be too efficient for its own good. If Global Link destroys the traditional farms with their smart agriculture, this is the only thing that can reboot the planet. I looked at the vials. The soft daughter had just found the ultimate leverage. It wasn't about shipping electronics. It was about the food on the world's table.
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
The most dangerous weapon in logistics isn't a strike or a surge, it's an artificial shortage. Sora Chen knew she couldn't outmaneuver my grid control, so she decided to starve me out by making the city hate me. If you control the narrative of the last mile, you can make a hero look like a villain in exactly 24 hours. But the soft daughter was about to show them that a seed is more powerful than a drone. By Tuesday morning, the air in the city changed. It was no longer the hum of drones, it was the silence of empty shelves. Sora Chen had used her political influence to divert all food shipments to an offshore processing center, citing safety concerns due to the Sterling Depot's electrical instability. The news headlines were brutal. Vera Sterling holds city food supply hostage for profit. Outside the gates of Berth 4, a crowd had gathered. They weren't businessmen in suits. They were angry citizens, led by provocateurs paid by Global Link. They threw stones at the windows of my warehouse, their shouts echoing against the brick. "Vera, you have to open the gates," Julian pleaded from the safety of the interior office. His face was bandaged from the electrical surge. "Sora says if you surrender the warehouse and the substation, she'll restore the food lines in an hour. People are getting desperate." "Desperation is exactly what she's selling, Julian," I said, looking down at the crowd from the balcony. "She didn't divert the food because of me. She diverted it to prove that without Global Link, the city dies. She's creating a monopoly through a manufactured famine." I turned to my father, who was sitting by the entrance to the seed vault. "Father, the seeds in that vault, they aren't just for a reboot. They're the original heirloom strains of this region. Wheat, corn, potatoes, crops that don't require Sora Chen's smart fertilizer or patented GMO protocols." "What are you thinking, Vera?" Silas asked, his eyes gleaming with a flicker of his old fire. "I'm thinking that a warehouse is a dead building unless it's moving something. And if Sora has blocked the ships and the drones, we'll use the one thing she thinks is dead, the analog rail." I called Elena Thorne again. The union was under pressure. Sora was offering them transition bonuses to leave the docks and work for Global Link's automated hubs. "Elena, I know your people are hungry. I know they're being offered a deal to betray the port, but I have a better one. I have a shipment of real cargo that Sora Chen can't track because it doesn't have an RFID chip or a digital signature. Vera, the city is blocked. No trucks are getting through the Global Link checkpoints." Elena's voice was strained. "We don't need trucks. We have the underground spur, the old coal delivery tunnels that run from Berth 4 directly into the central market district. They've been sealed since 1970, but they're on my deed." Within 2 hours, Marcus and his team had breached the sealed brickwork in the warehouse basement. Behind it lay a network of dark, cool tunnels that bypassed the city's modern infrastructure entirely. But we didn't have food yet. I had the seeds, but I needed the harvest. I used my father's black box contacts, the small, independent farmers in the valley who had been pushed to the brink of bankruptcy by Global Link's predatory pricing. I sent a message. The Sterling Spine is open. Bring your surplus to the Valley Junction. We pay in cash, and we move in secret. No drones, no sensors, just the tracks. The plan was a ghost train, a vintage 1950s diesel locomotive, one that didn't have a GPS tracker or a remote kill switch, was pulled out of the RGA's Heritage Museum by a group of sympathetic engineers. As the sun went down, the ghost train arrived at the Valley Junction. The farmers brought everything: crates of fresh vegetables, bags of flour, meat that hadn't been processed in a lab. They loaded the cars by hand, lit only by lanterns. "Sora's drones are patrolling the skies," Marcus warned, looking at his radar. "If they see the smoke from this engine, they'll call the National Guard for interference." Then we don't use the smoke. We use the coast run. We keep the engine at low RPMs and let the natural gravity of the coastal incline do the work. We'll be a shadow on the tracks. The journey back was a game of nerves. I stood in the cab of the locomotive, the smell of diesel and cold grease filling my lungs. We moved at 20 miles per hour, our lights off. Every time a Global Link drone passed overhead, my heart stopped. But they were looking for electronic signatures. They were looking for high-frequency transmissions. They weren't looking for a 60-year-old hunk of iron moving through the fog. We reached the Sterling Depot at 3 a.m. The underground spur was open. We moved the train directly into the basement of the Central Market, right under the noses of Sora Chen's security teams. The next morning, the Global Link famine broke, not because Sora opened the gates, but because the Central Market was suddenly overflowing with fresh, analog food. The prices were half of what Sora had been charging. The narrative flipped instantly. The greedy heiress was now the lady of the tunnels. I stood on my balcony as the crowd outside changed from a mob to a celebration. Sora Chen arrived 30 minutes later, her silver suit looking dull in the morning light. She didn't have Julian with her this time. "You've breached 42 safety regulations, Vera," Sora said, her voice trembling with cold fury. "Moving uncertified produce through unlicensed tunnels is a federal crime." "The people are eating, Sora," I said, leaning over the railing, "and the unlicensed tunnels are legally part of my historical preservation mandate. If you want to arrest me for feeding the city, do it in front of the cameras. They're already here." I pointed to a group of independent reporters who had followed the food trail into the tunnels. "You think this is a victory?" Sora hissed. "I'll buy the farmers. I'll buy the land they stand on. I'll make sure not a single seed grows in this valley unless it's a Global Link patent." "You can't buy what you don't understand, Sora," I said, reaching into my pocket and pulling out a handful of the heirloom seeds. "These seeds have survived for 100 years without your patents, and now I've distributed them to every community garden and every independent farm in the state. The black box isn't just a ledger anymore, it's a forest." Sora turned and walked away, her ghost ships hovering uselessly in the harbor. Her monopoly was broken, not by high-tech hacking, but by the oldest logistics in the world: a seed, a train, and a secret path. But as I watched her leave, Marcus ran up to me with his face pale. "Vera, we have a problem. The underground spur, the vibrations from the train triggered a structural collapse in the old foundation. But it didn't just bring down a wall, it revealed a third level, below the seeds, below the substation." I went down into the dark, following the beam of my torch. In the deepest part of the Sterling Depot, protected by thick lead shielding, was a room that wasn't on any map. It didn't contain ledgers or seeds. It contained a transmitter, a massive, ancient shortwave array that was still pulsing with a faint, steady green light. "It's not just a warehouse," my father whispered, appearing behind me. "It's a relay. Your grandfather wasn't just a logistics man. He was part of the continuity of government program. This warehouse is the command center for the National Emergency Broadcast System. If the digital network, Global Links network, ever fails, this is the only way the country speaks." I looked at the glowing green light. The soft daughter had just found the ultimate off switch for the digital age.
The fragility of a smart city is hidden in its convenience. When your light, your money, and your navigation all depend on a single cloud, you don't own your life, you lease it. Sora Chen decided to cancel the lease. At 6 p.m. on a Friday, the great silence began. But she forgot that before there was fiber, there was frequency, and frequency belongs to the ghosts. The blackout wasn't just about lights, it was a total digital decapitation. In an instant, every smartphone became a glass brick, ATMs froze, credit cards were rejected, and the automated traffic systems of the city locked up, creating a gridlock of silent, smart cars that couldn't move without their servers' permission. Global Link's ghost ships in the harbor pulsed with a steady, rhythmic violet light, the color of a forced system override. From my balcony at the Sterling Depot, I watched the city go dark. The only thing glowing was the harbor, where Sora's ships stood like beacons of a new authoritarian order. "Vera, the backup generators are holding, but the internal network is dead," Marcus shouted, his flashlight cutting through the dusty air of the warehouse. "Sora's blackout protocol has encrypted every local frequency. We can't even call the fire department." "We don't need the network, Marcus," I said, my voice sounding strangely calm in the unnatural silence. "We're going to the 3rd level." The ancient transmitter in the basement hummed with a primal energy as we bypassed the modern fuses. This wasn't a computer, it was a beast of vacuum tubes and heavy copper coils. My father stood by the dials, his hands moving with muscle memory he hadn't used in half a century. "Your grandfather used to say that when the world gets too complicated, the truth gets simple," Silas whispered. "This array is tuned to the emergency low band. It cuts through digital encryption like a hot knife through butter because it doesn't use data packets, it uses raw waves." I picked up the heavy Bakelite microphone. My heart was pounding against my ribs. "To anyone listening on the emergency frequencies, this is Vera Sterling. The city is in a forced blackout, but the Sterling Depot is still breathing. If you can hear this, find a battery-powered radio. We are starting the relay." I didn't just broadcast music or news, I broadcast logic. Using the maps from the black box ledgers, I began to coordinate the chaos. I directed the union workers, who all had old-school walkie-talkies, to the key intersections to manually direct traffic. I gave instructions to the independent hospitals on how to bypass their locked digital medicine cabinets. For the first time in history, the Ice Queen was the only person talking to the city, and the city was listening. But as my voice traveled over the airwaves, a familiar face appeared at the warehouse gate. It was Julian. He wasn't the arrogant brother anymore. He was bruised, bleeding, and clutching a glowing silver canister to his chest. "Vera, open the gate!" he screamed. I let him in. He collapsed onto the warehouse floor, the canister rolling away. I tried to stop her," he wheezed. "Sora isn't just turning off the power. She's starting the wipe. She's going to erase all land ownership records and debt ledgers tonight. When the lights come back on, the only legal reality will be the one on Global Link's servers. She'll own every house, every shop, and every port in the state." "And that canister?" I asked, picking it up. It was heavy and cold to the touch.
The root key, Julian coughed. The physical de-encryption core for the global link network. If you plug this into the transmitter, you can override her blackout and restore the city's original data. But they're coming for it, Vera. They're right behind me. Suddenly, the high-pitched whine of drones returned, but these weren't cargo drones. These were sleek black interceptor units, armed with high-intensity dazzlers and sonic cannons. Sora Chen was no longer pretending to be a CEO. She was a warlord reclaiming her property. "Marcus, defenses!" I shouted. The drones swarmed the warehouse, their lights blinding as they searched for a breach. They began to fire sonic bursts, shattering the remaining windows of the depot. The brickwork groaned under the pressure. "They're targeting the antenna," Silas yelled from the basement. "If they take out the roof, we're silent." I looked at the root key in my hand. I looked at Julian, who had finally chosen a side. Then I looked at the ancient transmitter. "Julian, get to the basement. Father needs someone to hold the voltage steady. Marcus, I need you to lead the interceptors away from the main roof. Use the old rail-mounted spotlights to blind their sensors." "What are you going to do, Vera?" Julian asked, his voice filled with a mix of fear and newfound respect. "I'm going to give the city their lives back," I said, "and I'm going to do it by burning out Sora's brain." I climbed the ladder to the roof, the wind whipping my hair. The interceptors were circling like sharks. I held the root key high. I didn't hide. I wanted them to see me. "Sora!" I shouted into the wind, knowing her drones were recording every second. "You want your future back? Come and get it." A massive command drone 3 times the size of the others descended from the clouds. A holographic projection of Sora Chen appeared in the air, 10 feet tall, a ghost of silver and light. "You're playing a losing game, Sora," the hologram said. "The analog age is a tomb. Give me the key and I'll let you live in the world I'm building. Refuse, and I'll level this warehouse and everyone in it." "You built your world on a cloud, Sora," I said, stepping toward the edge of the roof. "But clouds vanish when the sun comes up, and my warehouse, it's built on the spine." I didn't hand her the key. I jammed it into the manual override port of the warehouse's main lightning rod, a massive iron spike that had been connected to the substation's 7G relays I had modified earlier. "Julian, now!" I screamed into my headset. In the basement, Julian and Silas threw the final switch. The transmitter didn't just send a radio wave, it sent a pulse. Using the root key as a catalyst, it converted the 50,000-volt surge from the substation into a massive electromagnetic scream. The sky erupted in a blinding flash of blue-white light. The interceptor drones fell from the air like dead flies, their electronics fried instantly. The holographic Sora Chen flickered and dissolved into static. But the pulse didn't stop there. It traveled back through the global link network, following the very signals Sora was using to black out the city. Across the harbor, the ghost ships began to smoke as their server banks overloaded. The great silence was broken by the sound of 1 billion devices rebooting at once. The lights of the city flickered once, twice, and then stayed on. The original data, the deeds, the debts, the lives of the people surged back into the system, protected by the very key Sora had used to try and steal them. I fell to my knees on the roof, gasping for air. The root key was a blackened husk. The depot was smoking, but the city was glowing. Julian climbed up to the roof, helping me up. We looked out at the harbor. The Global Link ships were dark, their power gone. They weren't ghosts anymore. They were just hollow shells of steel. "You did it, Julian," whispered. "We saved them, Julian," I said, leaning on his shoulder. But as the morning sun began to rise over the Atlantic, I saw a fleet of different ships approaching. They weren't Global Link, and they weren't Sterling. They were flying the blue and white flag of the International Maritime Oversight. My father joined us on the roof, his face grim.
The blackout triggered an automatic global alert, Vera. The world is coming to see what happened in the guild's ledgers, and they're not going to like what they find in the guild's ledgers.
Victory is often just a change of perspective. To the people of the city, I was the woman who brought the light. To the International Maritime Oversight, IMO, I was a domestic terrorist with a high-voltage antenna. When the blue and white ships docked, they didn't come with aid. They came with handcuffs and non-disclosure agreements. But the Sterling name wasn't just a label on a ship, it was a cipher. The morning after the pulse, the depot was surrounded, not by drones, but by men in tactical gear with the IMO insignia. They moved with a cold, bureaucratic efficiency, seizing my servers, my ledgers, and my father's black box. Sora Chen was already in their custody, but as I watched her being led onto their flagship, she wasn't wearing zip ties. She was drinking coffee with the director. "They aren't here to investigate, Vera," Julian whispered, hiding with me in the shadow of the old locomotive. "They're here to clean up." Sora didn't fail. She provided a stress test for the global grid. Now they know the weaknesses, and they're going to eliminate the one person who can exploit them. "You," I said, looking at the tactical teams approaching the warehouse. "They want the root key fragments and the girl who knows how to use them." We retreated into the tunnels of the underground spur. My father, Silas, was already there, holding a dusty parchment map that looked older than the warehouse itself. He didn't look scared. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this day his entire life. "Vera, look at the logo," he said, pointing to the Sterling global crest on his signet ring. It was a stylized S entwined with a G, but beneath a magnifying glass, the curves of the letters formed a very specific geometric pattern, a railroad switch. "Your grandfather didn't name the company after himself. Sterling wasn't a name, it was a status. STERLING, Secure Transit and Emergency Resource Logistics Intelligence Network Group." "It's an acronym?" I asked, my mind racing. "It's a protocol. The warehouse isn't the heart of it, it's the gateway. The real Sterling Global is a decentralized data vault hidden within the physical ballast of the national rail network. Every mile of track we own has a fiber optic pulse running through the iron itself. It's a network that doesn't use the cloud, it uses the earth. To access it, I didn't need a password, I needed a location, and the final coordinate was hidden in the one place the IMO couldn't reach, the moving trains themselves. "Julian, you need to draw them away. Use the old transmitter to broadcast a fake signal from the North Junction. Make them think I'm trying to escape by sea. And you? I'm going to find the ghost in the machine." While Julian and Marcus created a diversion of sparks and radio static, I slipped into the deepest part of the rail yard. I boarded the ghost train, the old diesel locomotive from the food run. It was the only thing on the tracks that wasn't connected to the digital grid. I drove the engine out into the fog, heading for the Dead Man's Curve, a stretch of track that had been officially closed for 40 years. As the wheels thundered over the iron, the vibrations began to trigger a series of sensors hidden in the ties. Suddenly, the dashboard of the 1950s locomotive, which I had modified with a portable terminal, flared to life. A single file appeared, encrypted with a 265-bit key that could only be unlocked by the specific harmonic frequency of the train moving at exactly 44 miles per hour. The file was titled "The Architect's Will." I opened it. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a list of crimes, it was a map of the true monopoly. The Railroad Guild, GlobalLink, and the IMO weren't rivals. They were the same entity, a global syndicate called the Keystone. They had been intentionally sabotaging traditional infrastructure for decades to force the world into a subscription-based digital economy. The blackout Sora Chen caused wasn't a mistake. It was the final phase of asset tokenization. They wanted to turn every physical resource, water, land, food, into a digital asset they could delete at will. And the Sterling Protocol, It was the undo button. It contained the physical overrides for every automated switch and every digital lock in the hemisphere. "Vera, they've found us." Marcus's voice crackled over the shortwave. "3 IMO gunships are heading for your coordinates. They're going to derail you." I looked at the screen. I had the data, but I didn't have a way to tell the world. The IMO had blocked the sky. I was trapped on a single line of track heading for a dead end. But then I saw it on the map. The spine didn't end at the port. It connected to a forgotten underground terminal beneath the state capitol. "If I can get to the capitol's basement, I can plug directly into the National Broadcast Chamber," I whispered, "but I have to get through the IMO blockade at the Iron Bridge." I pushed the throttle to the wall. The old diesel engine roared, thick black smoke billowing into the night sky. Behind me, I could see the searchlights of the gunships cutting through the trees. They began to fire, the rounds pinging off the heavy steel of the locomotive. "Vera, you're not going to make it," Julian shouted over the radio. "They're preparing to blow the bridge." "Then I'm going to have to fly." I remembered the grid governor I had installed at the warehouse. I still had remote access to the substation 7G through the low-band transmitter. If I could overload the rail lines themselves, I could create a massive electromagnetic repulsive field, a maglev effect that would stabilize the train even if the tracks were gone. I initiated the Stirling overload. The tracks beneath the train began to glow with a fierce blue light. The air tasted of ozone. As the locomotive reached the Iron Bridge, a massive explosion tore through the central pylon. The tracks fell into the gorge, but the train didn't fall. For 6 seconds, held aloft by the sheer force of the electromagnetic surge I had triggered, the 60-ton engine glided through the air, clearing the gap and slamming back onto the tracks on the other side with a bone-jarring thud. The gunships veered off, their electronics scrambled by the massive EM discharge. I was through. I reached the Capitol's secret terminal at 3 a.m. I was covered in soot, my hands were raw, and my empire was in ruins. But as I plugged the Stirling protocol into the National Broadcast Terminal, I knew that the keystone was about to meet its architect. "This is Vera Stirling," I said, as my face appeared on every television and every smartphone in the country, bypassing the IMO's filters. "The world you're living in is a cage of code, but the keys are made of iron, and I'm about to give them back to you." I hit enter. Across the continent, the digital locks on public lands clicked open. The black boxes of the Guild were decrypted and published. The ghost ships were officially deregistered. The monopoly was over. But as the data finished uploading, the door to the broadcast chamber was kicked open. It wasn't the IMO, it was Sora Chen. She looked exhausted, her silver suit torn, but she was holding a heavy industrial detonator. "You think you've won, Vera?" Sora whispered. "You've just destroyed the only system that keeps 8 billion people fed. Without the keystone, there is no order. There is only the dark." "Then we'll learn to walk in the dark, Sora, because at least the dark is real." Sora looked at the detonator, then at the screens showing the world waking up. "You're just like your father. You'd rather burn the world than let someone else hold the matches." "No," I said. "I'm just like my grandfather. I know that sometimes you have to stop the train to save the passengers."
My dear ones, thank you for listening to this story. It makes me incredibly happy to feel that you are here with me. I try my best for you and post new videos every day, putting a piece of myself into them. If my stories resonate with you, your subscription and viewing of other videos will be the warmest support for me and inspiration to continue telling stories.
The aftermath of a revolution is rarely cinematic. There are no rolling credits, only the monumental task of cleaning up the debris. When I hit the Enter key at the Capitol, I didn't just delete a monopoly. I unplugged a world that had forgotten how to breathe without an algorithm. The chaos was immediate, but so was the clarity. For the first time in a century, the tracks were clear, and the future was unwritten. The weeks following the Keystone collapse were a blur of flashlights, paper manifests, and human voices. With the digital grid dismantled, the world had to return to the physical. The global link ships remained anchored like steel monuments to hubris, while the RGA's executives were being hauled before international courts. But in the city, something else was happening. The Sterling Protocol hadn't just exposed the crimes, it had provided the blueprints for a decentralized logistics commons. I returned to the Sterling Depot. It was no longer a derelict warehouse or a secret bunker. It had become the central station of a new era. "Vera, the North Junction is back online," Julian said, walking into the office. He looked different. The suit was gone, replaced by a sturdy work jacket. He didn't want a throne anymore. He wanted a wrench. "The independent cooperatives from the valley have arrived with the winter harvest. They're using the old steam hybrids. No sensors, no patents, just coal and grit." "And the IMO?" I asked, looking at a map of the new coastal routes. "They've been restructured into a transparency watchdog. They don't have the teeth to seize property anymore. The Sterling law ensures that the land beneath the tracks belongs to the communities they pass through. You've effectively socialized the spine, Vera." I walked down to the third level, the place where the seeds and the transmitter had saved us. My father, Silas, was there, sitting among the glass vials. He looked at peace. "You realized the final secret, didn't you?" he asked, his voice soft. "The Sterling Protocol wasn't just a weapon, Father. It was a gift. Grandfather knew that monopolies are like forest fires. They eventually consume themselves. He built the depot as a seed bank for infrastructure, something that could stay dormant for 60 years and then sprout when the world turned to ash." I reached into the hidden compartment where the transmitter had been. There was one final envelope I hadn't opened. It was labeled, "For the architect who chooses the tunnels over the cloud." Inside was a single physical deed to a network of ghost hubs scattered across the globe, old warehouses, forgotten stations, and hidden spurs. My grandfather had built an entire alternative world, a shadow spine that could function even if every satellite in the sky went dark. "It's a free network," I whispered. "A way to move food, medicine, and information without anyone being able to turn it off. It's your inheritance, Vera. Not the money, not the ships. The responsibility to keep the lines open." I didn't become a CEO. I became the coordinator. We rebuilt the port, but not as a fortress. We turned the Sterling Depot into a school for analog logistics, teaching the next generation how to read the earth, how to maintain the iron, and how to value the small details. Sora Chen's drones were repurposed to deliver medical supplies to remote mountain villages, but they were no longer controlled by a single server. They were part of the community. Sora herself had vanished. Some said she was in exile. Others said she was already building a new cloud in a country that didn't know better. But here, in the heart of the spine, she was just a cautionary tale. On the first anniversary of the Great Pulse, I stood on the roof of the depot. The city was glowing, not with the artificial violet of Global Link, but with the warm, uneven light of a living community. Below me, I heard the whistle of a train. It was the ghost train, now repainted in the Sterling colors, not black and gold, but the deep, honest red of iron oxide. It was carrying a shipment of heirloom seeds to the Northern Territories. "Soft, Father?" I asked, looking up at the stars. "No, Vera, you were the hardest of us all, because you had the strength to let go of the control." The warehouse door groaned shut behind me. I didn't need the key anymore. The gates were always open, the tracks were free, and the daughter who was too soft for business had finally finished the most important delivery in history. She had delivered the world back to itself.